People say I talk about some weird stuff, some far out stuff. But how about that chair that you're sitting in isn't solid? How weird is that? This reality is nothing like we think it is.
When I saw what Icke is doing, I was a bit jealous on him. Wow, look at what this guy's doing.
I don't know if anybody else could do it but him, actually.
We are in a period now where speaking your truth is not just important, it's utterly crucial to where humanity goes from here. The world needs renegades, and it needs them now. Now, talking of evil, something else, oh my God, I've been predicting for a long time that the territories, Palestinian territories, illegally occupied by Israel would start to be absorbed into Israel to become an expanded Israel. And of course, what we have, again, I've been saying this since he came on the scene, what we have in Donald Trump is the most Israel-controlled president, probably, in American history. And my God, there's some competition. And this week, he has officially recognized, on behalf of 325 million people, even though it's just him, Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is Syrian land that was taken in war. And there's been a reaction against it, but by others around the world. But the idea is, you put your foot in the door, you get America to do what Israel wants, which is recognize the Golan Heights as Israeli land, which it's blatantly not. And then you gradually pick off until it becomes accepted officially, more widely. We've seen this to an extent with the movement of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is a highly, highly provocative and symbolic move for Palestinians. And now others have started to do the same. And immediately that Netanyahu, this extraordinarily psychopathic, psychologically distorted human being. The moment that Trump officially pronounced that the Golan Heights should be Israeli land, Netanyahu began the campaign to have the same done about the West Bank. Because the game from the start was simply to buy time and buy time and buy time until all these Palestinian occupied lands, illegally occupied under international law, would be filled with so many Jewish-only settlements, it's an apartheid state, that there was no returning. I mean, people say, I believe in the two-party state. Well, you're an idiot then. There is no two-party state. You know why? There's no two states. Palestinians have been forced off their land colossally in 1948 when terrorists created Israel. But they're being forced off their land ever since by Jewish-only settlements, while the Jewish-only settlement promoters shout racism in all directions at everyone else. And the idea all along was we're having that land. And now we're reaching the point where they've got this sock puppet American president. The alternative media that supported him should be ashamed at the way that they were scammed. Many of them still haven't realised it. And now they've got the sock puppet. They're now getting closer and closer to official recognition of taking over Palestinian land. It's an absolute, utter disgrace. US blocks Syrian-Russian delegation from occupied Al-Tanf zone and rejects talks on trapped refugees. See, again, some of us have been pointing out for such a long time that America is a tyranny. The American government and the American military are a tyranny. They are global terrorists and bullies. And what happens with bullies is there's no rules. You just do what the bully says. This is how it is, says the bully, and this is how it's going to be. So it talks about, for instance, Venezuela. We must protect the people. We must protect democracy and all that. Which, of course, is the last thing they want. They want to destroy it. But then they'll go into a country like Syria, send its military in, with no invitation, with no UN mandate. They just do it because we do what we like, because we're a bully. And of course, all bullies in the end are cowards. That's why the bullies around Trump, like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and the neocons, they're all cowards. Because that's what bullies are. So here we have a situation where the United States is illegally occupying Syrian land and won't let the Syrian government in. The US troops occupying the 55-kilometer zone in southern Syria have blocked Russian and Syrian diplomatic and military officials from entering. The delegation said they wanted to assess the state of the ill-famed Rukban refugee camp. The delegation was denied access to the Al-Tanf zone, where it planned to monitor and conduct detailed assessments of refugees living at the remote and overpopulated Rukban camp. They also invited US officials for a meeting to develop step-by-step activities aimed at dismantling the camp. However, both offers were rebuffed by the US command. Yeah, it don't suit their agenda. The American side, which is directly responsible for what is happening in the Al-Tanf zone, illegally occupied by them, ignored the initiative aimed at saving the residents of Rukban and refused to participate in the coordination meeting, said the joint statement by Russian-Syrian coordination centers, spokespeople on the refugee repatriation. Noting that the US command's position was puzzling, it's not if you know the game, the center added that the refusal of access to the zone was under false pretenses of humanitarianism. Instead, it accused the Americans of trying to hide crimes against Syrians living in the US-occupied zone. Despite assurances from our American partners about joint cooperation, their goal is clearly not to save people dying from insanitary hunger, cold, and diseases of Syrian citizens. Well, of course it's not, because they're not only bullies, they're psychopathic bullies, which is one hell of a combination. Still on Israel, Netanyahu Anti-Defamation League, ADL, display racist views. Well, this story is telling us what we already know, anyone who's looked at it. Netanyahu, quote, Israel is not a state of all citizens, of all its citizens. According to the national state law we passed, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and not anyone else. It's an apartheid state. 50 years of occupation, 12 years of blockade, 600,000 Israeli settlers, 250 dead unarmed Gazan protesters, 3 one-sided wars in which 3,500 Palestinians in Gaza and about 150 Israelis have been killed. And that's not big enough a deal for us to utter a word of reprimand or turn off the financial spigot to Israel. The US is shelling out $10 million a day, $7,000 a minute in aid, not humanitarian but military aid, to a country that last summer passed the openly racist nation-state law that saw its prime minister create a coalition, including disciples of a Jewish supremacist, that last week disqualified pro-Palestinian parties from even entering the election ballot, while welcoming an anti-Palestinian candidate who is a member of a Jewish terrorist group. These outrageous acts did not outrage our politicians. Israeli leaders are emboldened. Prime Minister Netanyahu went on record over the weekend in defense of that indefensible nation-state law. When a TV personality dared to suggest that Israel is a state of all its citizens and that all people are created equal, he felt compelled to respond. Israel is not a state of all its citizens. According to the nation-state law, as I said, Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people. The person also said that Arabs in Israel have equal rights. Question, what is equal? Equal to the rights of second-class citizens. Netanyahu's next statement completely disassociated the Palestinian people from their own homeland. The Palestinian citizens, he said, have 22 nation-states around them and they do not need another. So the hypocrisy is just absolutely stunning. But you must not criticize them. And what they're doing is so outrageous that this is where the anti-Semitism industry and the protection racket, as I call it, protecting Israel from criticism and exposure, comes in to silence people. And this congresswoman in America, Ilhan Omar, who actually quite mildly pointed out the obvious, that American politicians are bought and paid for by Israel and its unbelievable network of organizations in America. And of course you can't say that, even though it's provably true. I mean, unbelievable. $22 million went into the election cycle of 2018 from Zionist groups and individuals. $22 million. And that buys a lot of politicians. So all she said was the truth. But of course what's happened is she's had this massive backlash. And there are many things that I would have profound disagreements with in terms of Congresswoman Omar. But on this, she's absolutely right. And, you know, if we're interested in the truth, we call things as we see them, not by who said them, but whether they're accurate or not, whether they're true or not. So we're having now pro-Israeli demonstrators rallying outside Omar events because, and this is worth just pointing out. Omar is one of the few, almost the only, not quite but close, American politician who has in any way called out Israel and its buying of American politics. The Israeli money basically owns American politics. That's why Israel gets whatever it wants. And despite all that power, one person has spoken out against what Israel is doing in America. But that's one too many. No voices of dissent are allowed. This is what we're seeing now in the British Labour Party, where people, even Jewish people, that criticise Israel are being thrown out and expelled. Another one this week, a lady called Jackie Walker, who is a black Jewish descended anti-racist activist. She's been expelled from the British Labour Party for what she said about Israel, which was and Zionism, etc., was incredibly mild. Again, far more mild than I would have said and do. And it's this very hysteria over very few individuals who are prepared to speak out against Israel and its psychopathic far-right government that tells you what's going on here. It's a scam. It's a protection racket. No voice at all must be allowed. That's why I was banned from Australia. There's 25 odd million people in Australia. The number of Jewish people in Australia is 0.4% of the population. And the group that orchestrated my ban through the government represents a tiny fraction of the 0.4%. But it represents the interests of Israel. That's why it's there, this group. And therefore, one voice means that you must be banned. No voice can be heard. And when you are so terrified of any alternative view to yours, that is a classic confirmation of just how much you have to hide. We just come to this case of Jackie Walker this week, who was expelled from the Labour Party. Let's just look, before we move on, at what she said. What happened is that she was at a anti-Semitism training session within the Labour Party. And someone secretly filmed her because it was a hit job. She was being targeted. She'd criticised Israel. She has to be destroyed. And she complained that Holocaust Memorial Day was only commemorating Jewish victims of Nazi Germany and not all the others, like Romanies and disabled and others, communists. And she said that she still hadn't heard a definition of anti-Semitism that she could work with. In other words, that she thought was justified. And she also asked the question of why Jewish organizations, including schools, say that they need high security. These are all reasonable questions, of course, in a sane and free society, but we don't live in either. And so the film was circulated, these felonies she committed. And over a long, long period, they've expelled her this week because the Labour Party is owned by Israel. Same theme. The political parties of major political parties, in fact, virtually all of them in Britain, daren't say boo to Israel. They're just, on their knees with their tongues out. But there was an element which Walker kind of represented, and others who've been expelled, who were prepared to criticize Israel and its disgusting inhumanity against Palestinians. So they have to be destroyed. It's the same principle. Here's a voice that we don't want people to hear. Despite all our power, we don't want people to hear. So we must destroy them. And so that's why the Labour Party's been targeted. And there's so many gutless people in the Labour Party, including its leader, Jeremy Corbyn, by the way, who just sat on their hands, zipped their mouth and allowed it to happen. Absolutely disgusting. And this is the kind of thing that goes on. These ultra-Zionist hate groups that target people to silence any criticism of Israel are peopled by some of the most appalling hypocrites you could ever come across. And here's a story that's been running. It's an organisation that's had a go at me over the years, called the Southern Poverty Law Centre, the SPLC. Southern Poverty Law Centre is an ultra-Zionist front that targets people that criticise Israel and targets people that criticise anything that this ultra-Zionist agenda wants. And it has lists that it calls hate groups. It's actually had to pay out millions in court cases for dubbing organisations hate groups when they're nothing of the kind. And now it's all kind of unraveling. The Southern Poverty Law Centre, the vicious left-wing attack dog, as it says in this story, used by the likes of Facebook, Twitter, Google and Amazon to identify hate groups, is unraveling. A week after co-founder Maurice Dees was ousted over sexual misconduct claims, with 24 employees signing a letter of concern over allegations of mistreatment, sexual harassment, gender discrimination and racism, the head of the SPLC, Richard Cohen, as well as the organizer's legal director, Rhonda Brownstein, resigned on Friday. So here we have an organization claiming to fight racism and all these other things, and now it's drowning in allegations of mistreatment, sexual harassment, gender discrimination and racism. But that's what you find. I'll tell you, after experience over the decades, it's what you find. These people that come out and claim to be anti-racist and anti-sexist and all this stuff, they turn out to be the bloody worst. Again and again and again. And there's an organization in this country called the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. Its chairman is on the British board of the Jewish National Fund. Jewish National Fund's an apartheid organization created in the just around the turn of the 20th century, responsible basically for starting the city of Tel Aviv. And it takes donations from around the world and then uses them to buy up land in Israel, which then Jewish people, and only Jewish people, are allowed to live on. And this character's going around pointing the finger and calling other people racist, but this is how it works, and the Southern Poverty Law Centre is a classic example of it.
The world needs renegades, and it needs them now.